Hello there, and welcome to Weird Music on the Glumberger channel. This is of course a show where we dive into unusual and peculiar albums of all different kinds of sorts, right? And I say different, but of course this is another episode diving into the ferocious world of Swans. And today we're looking at the follow-up album to that 1986 album Greed, the companion album of Holy Money. So, of course, as we're doing in the Swans episodes, let's ask ourselves, who were Swans? When Holy Money was recorded. Well, a point worth mentioning, though, is that Holy Money was recorded during the same sessions as Greed, as well as the single and EP releases of Time Is Money Bastard, which we discussed in the previous episode a bit, and A Screw, which we will discuss in this episode, actually. And so across these releases, we essentially have the same formation of Swans for the lineup. In any case, though, or mostly, in most cases anyway. Of course, though, for Holy Money, we have at the forefront the formidable force known as Michael Gira, performing vocals, pianos, samples, and handling production duties, of course. And then, of course, as we established in the last episode, now joined by the wonderful Jarbo on backing vocals. And then the quintessential Norman Westberg on guitar. And then it's from here we have an eclectic mix of musicians covering the different tracks. You get Algis Kizzies and Harry Crosby handling the bass duties. And then you get Ronaldo Gonzalez, Ted Parsons, and Ivan Nahum all performing drums across the various tracks. And so all in all, very much like Greed was, this is a rather wild and eclectic lineup for the band, but all together, in the different little variations they had for the individual songs, they push out this incredibly bleak industrial sound across the whole album, of course. No, and it's very weird though. I would argue though, it feels a little bit more consistent than what was presented on Greed, which is a little bit weird, but I'm not going to complain about it personally. Let's just dive into it though. Holy Money offers us 7 new tracks from the band, or it did when it was first released. And the album opens up with the incredibly intimidating A Hanging. And this one opens up with such terrific thumps of drums and angular guitars before these droning vocalizations from Jarbo and Gira just intertwine in this really brilliant way, creating this incredibly foreboding atmosphere. And as it progresses, the whole thing just gets so much darker and downright scary in its own right, as Gira just starts crooning this peculiar lament that is, a lament of essentially doing anything for God, And the focal point of what the lyrics are trying to present here, I would argue, is this idea of hanging for God, which is scary, right? But it creates the whole thing though, the music, the lyrics and stuff, it creates this really unusual atmosphere. And especially with those instrumentals, actually, they're just pushing it all along in the background with these really peculiar droning effects as well. And I find it to be a starkly stronger opening to the album than what Greed had with the opener of Fool. As to me, A Hanging kind of establishes some of those newer ideas that the band was exploring, but it feels a little bit more concise on this one. Like, it's coming together a lot better, You got those elongated vocals, the droning backing vocals, this slow tempo, which, to be fair, the slow tempo has always been a part of Swans, in this era of it. But it's all culminating in this constant build-up of this really uncomfortable and terrifying atmosphere that places us in this very surreal landscape. Anyway, on to track 2. This is an interesting one, the very short track of You Need Me, a 1.5 minute song from Swans. And it's very unusual, I think, having an actual song with lyrics and stuff being so short. Especially when we consider the kind of stuff Swans will or even have been up to. Regardless though, this track, it gives us that piano which was kind of established on the previous album Greed, as a sort of part of the Swans soundscape, if that makes sense. And on this one you've got Jarbo doing the lead vocal duties, and I think there's something very exciting about it all. There's a very passionate delivery to her vocal performance which showcases her great talent as both a singer and a performer. With only 2 paragraphs of lyrics though, we get this short expression of what to me feels like a one side of a rather toxic relationship of sorts, apologising and yet almost worshipping the other in what feels like a very unhealthy manner. I think it's an interesting little track that helps showcase much more of what Swans could and eventually would do as a band, as well as giving Jarbo the chance to sort of show off a bit of her skills, amongst the Swans repertoire, I would say. But beyond that, though, it's lovely and dark as it is. There's not really that much to discuss on this one, sadly, but it's definitely interesting, especially as a piano-led ballad, or a sort of piano-led, wouldn't call it a ballad, a piano-led track anyway. I think it's a little bit more interesting than Fool from the previous album. Speaking of though, track 3 we get Fool 2, a reprise of Greed's opening track, and this gives us an alternative mix of the track that seems to build up much more on that original skeletal framework of the original version of the song, and instead it expands it out much more by adding drums and fuzzy guitars and this quintessential Swan sound. And I think the very peculiar drum pattern that's now dominating the song, much more of the song now, it helps give it much more of a forward momentum than the original version, as well as having these different instrumental elements coming in and out of the mix that make it more interesting to listen to, maybe. Obviously up for debate, maybe some people prefer the original, but it's just how I feel, of course. Regardless, it still comes across as an incredibly intimidating song again, but as much as there are, elements on this newer version that I prefer, I still feel there's some other elements that I'm still not too sure about at all. Though it might just be me, I feel like, oddly enough, like the instrumentals on Fool 2, I feel are way stronger than what it was on Fool Greed version. However, when it comes to the vocal delivery, or it might be the mixing of the vocals into the song in general, I feel like the original vocal performance on Greed's version of Fool was way stronger. And something about Fool 2 just feels a little bit flatter for some reason, but I'm not 100% sure why that is. It might just be me though. It's like but personally, I just think that there's a lot of resonance that's happening on the original version that's now kind of missing on this one, and I feel if you kind of put it all together, the best bits of Holy Money's Fool and the best bits of Greed's Fool, you could get this phenomenal track, I would feel. But it is what it is, and it's just my opinion of such, and it is what it is. Let's move on though. I would argue that you could call this the title track of the whole album though. You're given a screw Holy Money. So immediately on this track, as soon as it starts, you get confronted with such an abrasive guitar tone before the drums and bass to start that rhythmic pounding with that industrial style beat. And it's an incredibly satisfying beat, to be fair. It perfectly establishes the brilliant scene before Jira just starts this unsettling croon. Lyrically though, This is perhaps one of those quintessential Gira tirades into the ugly, uncomfortable side of power and control in this rather nasty sexual context, to be fair. And it's kind of gross, but, you know, that's most likely the point, right? Especially in the expression of such a commanding force, you know, as though someone is lording their power over someone who is being submissive, or even arguably perhaps being exploited, maybe. It's an incredibly uncomfortable track, and it's one that just makes my skin crawl for some reason, but things like that I make it interesting, and I like it that it's making me feel that way, if that makes sense, you know? It's getting that emotion, that expression across in a very strong way. Moving right along though, we get the longest track on Holy Money, the 7.5 minute Another You, which opens up with this almost lo-fi distorted version of The Man with the Harmonica. I'm not sure it is a harmonica, but it kind of sounds like one. It could perhaps be one of Gira's many different kinds of samples that he utilises. Anyway though, this one is another one of those incredibly sludgy tracks that pushes with that monolithic drum pattern, backed up by that angular distortion of guitars and bass that sounds so quintessential of the early era of Swans, of course. And this is another one of those existential dirges that we should be no doubt used to by now from the band. The lyrics are rather interesting on this one though. They speak of someone standing still in a room trying to remember whom one is, and the desire to hurt someone but not being able to. And I think it all comes together in this very uncomfortable existential way, but it's phenomenal as a result. And I would say that, you know, this is a particular highlight across the whole album though. You know, even with that incredibly slow pace, it's just so satisfying to listen to, especially when you get the guitar just climbing up and up in the background of the whole composition. And as well, I should mention that it's around 5 minutes into this track though, you get this really unusual instrumental section whilst Gira is just, you know, howling and screaming these stretched out vocals that are so downright scary at times, before you get this repeated refrain in the outro of "I should have hurt you." It's a brilliant moment on this whole album, and with such an uncomfortable atmosphere that permeates through the whole entire track. And so, we're basically approaching the end of this album with its final two tracks, the penultimate track being Money is Flesh 2. And this is an alternative version of the closing track for the previous album, Greed. And so, I'll be honest right here, Money is Flesh is a track that I don't really rate all that much across Swans' discography for some reason. I didn't actually mention it much in the video for Greed for some reason, but although it works well as a closer for Greed, it's not really my favourite track on that album, and there's some elements on it I find rather grating for some reason. But with this version though, with Money is Flesh number 2, you're getting a much faster tempo that is prevalent on this, and it makes it sound a lot more industrial, or like, you know, just more hurried and frenetic. And to me, it just sounds like, you know, this rather giant factory machine that is just processing and producing this really nasty looking material just constantly. And I feel though a lot of the musical elements on this one, they're sort of a lot stronger than they were on the previous version for some reason. There's something just nastier and angular about this particular version that, to me, it just makes it altogether a much more enjoyable listening experience, I would argue. And of course, it should be said though that there's definitely people out there who probably prefer the version that Greed has, no doubt. As, you know, we all have our different opinions and tastes and things. I just personally feel, of my opinion, that this version of Money is Flesh has come together much more strongly, I would feel. But that being said, if you, the viewer watching this right now, let me know, what is your favourite version of Money is Flesh? Do you prefer the Greed version or prefer the Holy Money version? But let's move on though. We get the final track of Holy Money it ends with the incredibly formidable and intimidating coward. And I'm not sure why exactly, but I think the opening lines from Jira in this that open this track up is a phenomenal way to start this one off. There is something so visceral and intimidating and nasty about how his voice is sounding. It's just echoing ever so slightly before even a single instrument comes in. And then when they do, you're just given that quintessential slow crawl that Swans do, that incredibly dirgy, chugging low-end sound, that bass that's just scraping across the very strings and stuff, and that just rhythmic pounding away. It's, oh man, so Swans, right? Yeah, lyrically though, this one is incredibly nasty, I feel, and it's a really uncomfortable track that has been interpreted to be about a submissive person essentially begging to be punished for being weak and to continue the cycle of abuse, which is nasty, really nasty, right? What I find interesting though is that throughout this whole song though, as Jira very uncomfortably just almost murmurs the lyrics themselves, you have these backing vocalizations of screams and shouts and growls that further paint this really uncomfortable miasma. And it all just mixes in so well. It's like it just all just sits comfortably there and just comes in at just these perfect little moments, and it creates this incredibly intimidating track, one that we should no doubt be used to by Swans in their music, right? And it all proceeds though just with this slow, sludgy pace. It never really climbs up to those manic levels of distortion or madness that one might expect, I feel, but instead it just continues in the same vein, just pump, push, 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 off it goes, And I think it's brilliant. And thus, Holy Money ends, of course. We've covered the companion album to Greed now, which I would argue this, I would say that it continues a great number of the themes and concepts that's being explored there, but it pushes it out in this arguably more satisfying way. And I don't know why, I just feel like Holy Money is just a little bit more cohesive as an album overall, I personally feel that the experimental elements that were being explored by the band during this era just come together a lot more strongly on Holy Money. As well as the reworked versions of the songs that were on the previous album. They just feel way better on this one, but that is just my opinion. Don't get me wrong. And so, as we've done with pretty much every Swans album we've discussed so far, there's been numerous releases, numerous versions of the album, and so forth and stuff. Especially with being 7 tracks actually on the original version. Of course they would expand it out in later versions. And so, in the last episode, I did discuss the specifics of this box set I have of Cop, Young God, Greed, and Holy Money. So I don't really want to bring up the same point about this one again. I've already mentioned my opinion of this particular multi-disc set, or whatever you'd call it, compilation. So yeah, we're not going to go into it again, don't worry. But to go back to Holy Money though, to discuss it and certain versions of the album, new other versions of it, including actually the version that is available on the Swans Bandcamp page, it partners up the album with the EP release of A Screw. And this features 3 additional tracks of A Screw, Blackmail, and A Screw Holy Money Mix. And so, the opening of A Screw is an alternative version of the track that really prominently features trumpets and trombones, performed by Greg Grinnell and Keen Kersey respectively. And the inclusion of brass kind of pushes forward that more industrial, dance style flair to it kind of thing, if that makes sense, it's interesting, but I don't know if it's better, truth be told, but it's certainly interesting, to be fair. And although we're skipping a track in and mentioning the last one instead, but the version of A Screw Holy Money Mix, it's essentially just an instrumental version of the track, which is why I'm mentioning it now here. But I'll say here though, it is interesting to listen to because it gives you a much clearer understanding of the inner mechanisms of what's making up this particular track, if that makes sense. You get that rhythmic pounding and those peculiar sounding instrumentals, and so you get that without the Jira crooning and vocalizations over top, which is, it's not great, but it's interesting, right? However, there is the middle track on here, the second track on the CP, that is definitely worth mentioning, and that is Blackmail. Blackmail is a piano-led ballad by Jarbo, featuring an incredibly beautiful vocal performance that showcases the incredibly pretty side to her voice. And so it's actually worth mentioning here, Blackmail was eventually reworked for the Swans' brilliant album Children of God, which fleshed out many of the original ideas that were being presented here on A Screw. And on this version though, you're given this really slow-moving melancholy track that is incredibly bittersweet and full of a lot of emotion as it progresses along. And I find it interesting that, it's, even though Fool kind of established a sort of slow piano-led ballad type thing or whatever, this version of Blackmail though, it was very much unlike anything that Swans were sort of being known for at the time. But I would argue it's also perhaps one of the many genesis for some of the ideas that the band would explore later on in other albums and stuff. The kinds of song structures and instrumental practices that you'd see them, really branch out with. And thus, it's an incredibly interesting composition worth mentioning here, but of course we will return to it again, of course, in a lot more detail when we cover the Children of God album, of course. And so with that, we've essentially covered the entirety of Holy Money and also the entirety of this disc, this big box set disc as well. So I'm kind of glad to be stopping to talk about this because as I mentioned on Greed, I don't like this version of it. It just is what it is. But yeah, Holy Money though, it's no doubt in my opinion, a rather strong entry within the early Swans era. I don't know if I think it's as good as something like Cop or Filth, but it's still very interesting and culminates many of those noisy industrial sounds that the bands were exploring and pushing out with their albums. But it sort of explores it within new ideas and concepts, and yet presents it all in this rather cohesive fashion for the most part. And even though it's exploring new ideas, you still get those incredibly angular guitars and that really big vocal sounds and that really visceral edge that you so often see in the Swans music, and I just think it's interesting. Obviously, of course, it's very obvious to you, the viewer, that I prefer Holy Money to Greed, and it's not that I think Greed is bad in any way. I just think some of it doesn't gel as well together as it should do, but it is what it is, I just think Holy Money just it kind of ticked more of the right boxes, if that makes sense, and managed to showcase a lot more of those ideas or new ideas in a much more cohesive manner. But to be fair though, I think the whole Swans discography is only going to get better and better from here on out. We will see though. And with that then, we have come to the end of today's episode of Weird Music. I'll say here, I do apologise for how sporadic the Swans episodes are being in terms of writing them and releasing them. The main problem is writing these. Writing the scripts is definitely the hardest thing. Well, writing the reviews, actually, you could call them, is definitely the hardest bit of all of these things. But, just be patient, we'll work our way through them bit by bit, right? And as mentioned though, we've got some incredibly exciting albums from the band coming up that, if you're a fan of the Swans, you no doubt know exactly which ones I'm on about. I mean, I'll be honest, I'm unsure of how they're actually going to turn out in the future videos, but I guess we'll see, right? I should also mention here though, just before we sign off though, that it was around 4 to 5 months ago, which I apologise for, that I did a poll asking whether we should start covering the live albums by Swans. And I'm very grateful for those who voted in the poll, and the small majority voted yes. So if I've got this correct, the next Swans album we'll be covering will be the brutal live album of Public Castration is a Good Idea. And I'm gonna be honest with you right now, I've always been more of an album type person. I love listening to albums by bands for some reason. And for some reason, especially with Swans, the live albums are something that I really have not spent much time diving into and exploring. But in a weird way, I'm kind of excited to do it for the channel, if that makes sense. I'm looking forward to, diving into these live albums, because I've heard so many interesting things about them, especially public castration, right? I guess we'll find out what's going on with them. In any case, though, I would like to thank you for watching today's episode of Weird Music, as well as also thank you for the support this little series is getting. I'm just constantly blown away by, the response that each of the videos are getting, and also I do read every single one of your comments as well. I'm always really happy to read your thoughts about these particular albums as well. I find it fascinating to know what you, the viewer, are thinking as well. And so with that, I wish you all the best. I hope you take care, all the best, and bye bye for now. Bye bye!